Move on though and talk about Tottenham's Labour MP David Lammy's new book, Tribes. It's about how the decline in our sense of belonging as a society has led to increasingly tribal politics. Richard Tudor spoke to David and began first by asking about how the coronavirus outbreak may affect our sense of nationhood and society.
There's something very peculiar about the way in which this virus, yes, of course, it brings out a selfishness. The hoarding, the ransacking of supermarkets is the negative side of the story. But it reminds us that we're human. It reminds us that we're all vulnerable. It reminds us that we can make a difference. It reminds us that we share common space in a nation, particularly as countries stop flights and pull up the borders. And in a sense, that's the hope that can come from this horrible, horrible pandemic.
One of the key themes in the book is the decline of municipal civic life in Tottenham. And what effect has that had on your constituency and your constituents?
Because the book has so much memoir, I was sort of reflecting on what it was like to grow up in Tottenham in the 1970s, but I think across much of the country. And things were free. Things like hiring a bike and riding around the park, things like going to the swimming pool, things like Cubs, Scouts, Boys Brigade, all of these things I did for very little money or no money at all. And I just think that's changed dramatically. And there's not a sense that they're any longer responsible almost for that era. And I do think that that affects people's sense of belonging, and where there isn't a sense of belonging, people fill it with something else, and they're filling it with a kind of tribalism.
One theme in your constituency in Tottenham is gentrification. What would you say the effects are of gentrification on community cohesion in your constituency?
The poorer you are, the further and further out you live, the further and further you have to commute to work. Like Paris, you can't live centrally any longer. The younger you are, the harder and harder it is to have that stake in society, because you can't actually ever own at a time when we're not really building social houses to the quantities that we need. And then you see neighbourhoods that you've been attached to where you get your sense of belonging, but you can no longer afford to live. I applaud Spurs for building their stadium, but the truth is it's not just down to them to regenerate, it's got to come from the local authority, it's got to come from the mayor, it's got to come from the government. They've got to have the resources and they've got to want to do it. And or you do just have an island with not enough around it.
So if you had to sum up in sort of 30 seconds what the manifesto of the book is, what the call to arms of the book is?
We don't need to disappear into smaller and smaller hateful tribes. We can forge a new need to belong and therefore rebuild our nation and come back together. That's the theme of the book, and I reflect quite deeply on the tribes to which I belong, whether it's Tottenham and the Caribbean community, whether it's Peterborough, where I was a cathedral chorister, or whether it's Niger, where I have some of my DNA.